Very well, William whispered to me. So another door does exist, but we are not to know about it. In 1980, Italian semiotician and philosopher Umberto Eco published his debut novel that was incredibly successful both commercially and critically. It sold over 50 million copies worldwide, which is astounding given the complex, multi-layered and symbolic nature of this work. Il nome della rosa, The Name of the Rose, has quickly become one of my favorite novels of all time, and it is my job today to encourage you to give this novel a try by offering up 5 tips to read it in order for you to get the most out of it. Because even though this is a novel that sold many copies, it is also a novel that is often abandoned because of its richness in symbolism. So in this video we'll talk all about the mysterious library, the theological and philosophical discourse at the heart of the novel, the meaning of laughter, and how, even though this is a very well-researched novel set in the 14th century, it is essentially a postmodern work of literature. I'll be, of course, reading you plenty of quotes from my edition here. This is the Everyman Library edition, translated into English by William Weaver. A very good translation, I can highly recommend it. I did so much underlining in here. There are just a ton of great one-liners in this work, like what seemed a lack of confidence was only curiosity, or the step between ecstatic vision and sinful frenzy is very brief. Yeah, before we get into it though, in case this is the first video of mine that you're watching, hello, I'm Maria. I study comparative literature at the University of Vienna, and I make videos about languages and literature here on this channel. I've also recently released a course about the classics of French literature, so if you're interested in that, it's linked in the description box below. I'll also link my Ko-fi account in case you want to support the channel financially. I always really appreciate that. Let's get into the video now. Firstly, a little bit of background. Umberto Eco was nearly 50 years old when he published this debut novel of his, and his lifelong research in medieval studies, science, symbols, languages, history, philosophy, and literature went into every page of this book. Our narrator in the story is Azzo of Melk, who is an old Benedictine monk preparing for his own death. And in doing so, he's writing down a series of strange events that happened to him one week when he was a young boy traveling to an Italian monastery in the year 1327. So essentially what we are reading is him recalling a week in his life when he was about 18 years old. So back then, young Azzo was a servant of William of Baskerville, a Franciscan friar from England, and together they visit this unnamed abbey in the north of Italy in order to participate in a theological disputation, which we'll get into in depth later. When they arrive there, though, a strange event has just occurred. Adelmo of Otranto, a monk of the abbey, more specifically an illuminator, so someone who creates illustrations for manuscripts, just fell to his death from the highest tower of the abbey. No one's really sure whether it was suicide or whether someone pushed him down, but the abbot, the head of the abbey, his name is Addo of Fossanova, asks William to investigate this murder during his stay, and this mystery of what happened to Adelmo creates kind of the main plot strand throughout the novel. Side plots are a love story between our narrator Azzo and a girl from the village, the theological discussion on whether Jesus was poor and what that would mean to the church, the mystery of the library, which Azzo and William soon suspect to have something to do with the murders, and a recurring discussion on the meaning and legitimacy of comedy and laughter. So it is a detective story, but really only on the surface. Eco's claim for this novel was for it not just to be thrilling, but to create a complex world that allows a lot of reflection for the reader. And I'm gonna read you the first paragraph of the prologue for you to get a little bit of a feel of his rich language. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This was beginning with God, and the duty of every faithful monk would be to repeat every day, with chanting humility, the one never-changing event whose incontrovertible truth can be asserted. But we see now through a glass darkly, and the truth before it is revealed to all. Face to face, we see in fragments, alas, how illegible, in the error of the world. So we must spell out its faithful signals, even when they seem obscure to us, and as if amalgamated with a will wholly bent on evil. Now, of course, there is a spectrum of readers for this book, right? The ideal reader would be able to decode absolutely everything that Umberto Eco packed into those pages. But I think that would require studying all the same subjects in depth that he has. That's a pretty high requirement. The more superficial reader maybe just finds the detective story really enthralling, and that gets him or her through the book. So in this video, I want to give you as much information as possible for you to feel equipped to decode the medieval religious structures and a lot of things that Eco, I think, wanted to tell us, right, to kind of move you up that line without necessarily having to study all of theology and the Middle Ages and philosophy. And I feel like Eco actually speaks to us directly of what it means to make a book ours, to not just read it for the information, but to kind of absorb it. Here's page 356. Books are never made to be believed, but to be subjected to inquiry. When we consider a book, we mustn't ask ourselves what it says, but what it means. So yeah, this to me is the definition of an inexhaustible work of literature. I mean, just imagine studying, literature, philosophy, theology, medieval studies, and semiotics for 30 years, and then you write a book where you pack all of that into 500 pages. That's kind of what this is, and it feels incredibly exciting. The first point I feel that is important to understand is the theological discussion at the heart of the novel. So, as I mentioned in the intro, William and Atso go to this abbey in the first place in order to participate in a discussion concerning the poverty of Christ. This poverty dispute in the 14th century actually happened, and Eco would know about that, being a medievalist. And the gist of the dispute was this. The Pope, on the one hand, supported by the Dominican order, and the king, on the other hand, supported by the Franciscan order, got into a fight. The Franciscan order, to which William belongs, idealizes poverty. They say that Christ has lived a life that lacked possessions, full of humility, he didn't need things, and they try to imitate that. They themselves have barely any possessions, they are not striving for worldly power in any way, and their big idol is Francis of Assisi, who you maybe know for preaching poverty. The Dominicans, on the other hand, they represent more of the hierarchical, powerful and possessive side of the church. They preached that possessions and owning things actually legitimizes belief and supports the institution, so it's a good thing. So in this big meeting that takes place in the abbey, those two sides meet and discuss. Now, I know that can sound a little bit dry. Truly, those disputes, they go on for pages and pages and pages and pages. And fun fact, when Umberto Eco actually handed in the manuscript for this novel, the publisher was like, do we really need all that? Maybe we could scratch 100 pages of this theological background. But Eco declined. He said that a novelist builds a world that needs this historical background, otherwise the plot is not understood in its full context. And if you think about it, it's actually quite a fascinating question. Leaving the fact whether you are in any way religious or part of the Catholic Church or whatever, it did have a massive impact on how we developed. Right, they knew back then that this discussion is important because answering that question would kind of determine in which direction the church would develop. There are, of course, a bunch of ethical considerations tangled up in this question as well. You have to imagine back then the church made a lot of money by Christians just giving money to priests and bishops in order to be forgiven their sins. And William, throughout the novel, criticizes the church, right? He realizes that in this conflict, the Pope, but also the king, they both greed for power and they equally miss the point of living a just life, right? To them, power is the point and not the well-being of common people. Here's a quote. Atzo saying, "So the cellarer was right. The simple folk always pay for all, even for those who speak in their favor." And a little later, "So it is," William answered me sadly. "And if you are really seeking a glimmer of justice, I will tell you that one day the big dogs, the Pope and the Emperor, in order to make peace, will pass over the corpses of the smaller dogs who bid one another in their service." Next, I think it is important to understand a little bit about the history of comedy, because there's a lot of talk in this book about Aristotle's second book of Poetics, the Comedy. So, in case you don't know, Aristotle's writings about poetics, which I have here, are the earliest writings that humanity has about dramatic and literary theory. It's an extremely important text, and it had a lot of significance also in medieval times because Aristotle was well respected. The thing is, what I'm holding in my hand and what we all have nowadays is just one of the two books of Aristotle's Poetics, the one about tragedy. The other one, the one about comedy, has gotten lost at some point during the past 2000 years. No one knows what happened, maybe someone just didn't translate it. And so it is a little bit of a myth, a really big question in literary theory is, what happened to this book? And most importantly, what was in it? What did Aristotle say about the comedy? Did he deem it important? Let's just say that if this book would be rediscovered again, that would be one of the greatest and most important finds in literature. So I mention all that because it is an important background to have when reading The Name of the Rose, because there are a lot of discussions about the purpose of laughter and comedy in this book, specifically between William and Jorge, the old librarian, and they often mention Aristotle's Poetics. Jorge is convinced that laughter diminishes respect for and belief in God. He believes the book would be dangerous and that it kind of would subvert the order of religion and society. And, maybe he'd be right, because laughter is always a sign of openness and revolution. Here's a discussion between William and Jorge about laughter. Let me read you a quote. "We talked about laughter," Jorge said sharply. "The comedies were written by the pagans to move spectators to laughter, and they acted wrongly. Our Lord Jesus never told comedies or fables, but only clear parables, which allegorically instruct us on how to win paradise, and so be it." "I wonder," William said, "why you are so opposed to the idea that Jesus may have laughed. I believe laughter is a good medicine, like baths, to treat humors and the other afflictions of the body, melancholy in particular." "Baths are a good thing," Jorge said, "and Aquinas himself advises them for dispelling sadness, which can be a bad passion when it is not addressed to an evil that can be dispelled through boldness. Baths restore the balance of the humors. Laughter shakes the body, distorts the features of the face, makes man similar to the monkey. Monkeys do not laugh. Laughter is proper to man. It is a sign of his rationality," William said. "Speech is also a sign of human rationality, and with speech a man can blaspheme against God. Not everything that is proper to man is necessarily good. He who laughs does not believe in what he laughs at, but neither does he hate it. Therefore, laughing at evil means not preparing oneself to combat it, and laughing at good means denying the power through which good is self-propagating. It's kind of a conflict between two worldviews, right? The rational and curious versus the repressive. And laughter, I believe, is at the turning point. So again, that's another way in which this book is like a great conversation, a great dialogue between two worldviews that clash and explain one another in a way as well. I believe in the first year of my studies I learned about, what was that? I don't know who that said anymore, but that basically why Dostoevsky's novels are so great is because his characters represent parts of society. And, you know, when we're reading about William and Jorge, we are actually reading about whole groups of humans that have and share these beliefs, like scientists and religious people maybe. And if you want to take it a step further, we're also reading about maybe a fight that is always going on inside of us as well, right? I can definitely have a bit of both. And as readers, I think we identify a lot with William of Baskerville, right? He's the enlightened medieval scholar. He's rational. He stands in the spiritual tradition of William of Ockham, who shaped the principle of frugality. If you've heard about Ockham's razor, it's basically a principle where if you're looking for an explanation for something, you always look for an explanation constructed with the smallest possible set of elements. That's what Wikipedia says. As a silly example, if you want to find out why it rains, you could say, well, it looks like a lot of water has just evaporated and at some point it has to come down again. That's a way simpler of an explanation than saying, well, there are all these gods and eventually they got in a fight, and then for one god to punish the other one, they made it rain, and that's why that's today or something. Like, that's way more of an elaborate, complicated explanation than the first one. And Ockham's razor is actually also a pillar of modern science, right? As is observing, comparing, building hypotheses. Probably more readers identify with that and identify with William, who mentions William Ockham and also Thomas Aquinas throughout the novel. Point number 3, understanding the complexities of the library. Now, the main locale in this novel is, of course, the library of the Abbey. And the library of The Name of the Rose is actually based on the Library of Babel, a short story by Argentinian poet and writer and friend of mine, Jorge Luis Borges. In this short story, Borges talks about a library that contains all possible books and the hope and overwhelm that would elicit in people. Even beyond this short story, though, libraries have always been a symbol of knowledge, power, order, and cultural heritage. Here's a photo of the Kloster Ebenbach im Rheingau. This is where the movie with Sean Connery was set, and it gives us a glimpse into libraries of the Middle Ages. What you can see on the photo is actually the scriptorium, a light-filled room that usually is close to the library, where monks sit all day and copy, translate, and illustrate texts. Remember that first monk that died was an illuminator, right? He would sit there and illustrate some of the texts. And I have to, as a detour, just read you this extremely beautiful quote, page 86 of the scriptorium. Atzo observes the beauty of that room and the abundance of light that flows in. I love this. Quote, "The abundance of windows meant that the great room was cheered by a constant diffused light, even on a winter afternoon. The panes were not colored like church windows, and the lead-framed squares of clear glass allowed the light to enter in the purest possible fashion, not modulated by human art, and thus to serve its purpose, which was to illuminate the work of reading and writing. I have seen at other times and in other places many scriptoria, but none were there shown so luminously in the outpouring of physical light which made the room glow, the spiritual principle that light incarnates, radiance, source of all beauty and learning, inseparable attribute of that proportion the room embodied. For three things occur in creating beauty. First of all, integrity or perfection, and for this reason we consider ugly all incomplete things. Then proper proportion or consonance, and finally clarity and light. And in fact we call beautiful those things of definite color. And since the sight of the beautiful implies peace, and since our appetite is calmed similarly by peacefulness, by the good and by the beautiful, I felt myself filled with a great consolation, and I thought how pleasant it must be to work in that place. I cannot, that's so beautiful. Anyways, my point in showing you this is to illustrate the point that this might not seem like a very big library, but for the time it was. You have to imagine that back then texts were mostly written on animal skin, which was expensive and a lot of work to produce, which means that a large library back then maybe had hundreds of books, not thousands or hundreds of thousands. The library in the name of the Rose is described to be the most complete one of its time, which is definitely heightening its meaning for the world, and you can really see how excited William is when he first steps foot into it, because it represents the knowledge of humanity at that time. And Eco imagines how such a library would be treated, what the layout would be like, and who has access to it and who doesn't. Now, I'm not gonna go into the layout of the library. The only thing I'll say is it's quite masterful how it combines basically the round principle, which always stands for fullness and completion, with rectangles, which is a way to make the most space for books, basically. I thought that was really beautiful. Then there's also all these uneven numbers. I think there's like 11 doors or something. I don't know, that's like an entire rabbit hole you can get into. But something I can tell you more about is who has access to that library and who doesn't, because that is the subject of a paper that I'm currently writing. It's going to be about the library in the name of the Rose as a symbol for autocratic and repressive education policies in our current time. I argue in my paper that only two monks having access to the library, the librarian and the assistant librarian, and those two being the only ones that can orient themselves in the building and that decide what others get to read, is very emblematic of what's happening in our education system. But let me read you a quote. Page 47, where the library is first described. The library was laid out on a plan which has remained obscure to all over the centuries, and which none of the monks is called upon to know. Only the librarian has received the secret from the librarian who preceded him, and he communicates it while still alive to the assistant librarian, so that death will not take him by surprise and rob the community of that knowledge. And the secret seals the lips of both men. Only the librarian has, in addition to that knowledge, the right to move through the labyrinth of the books. He alone knows where to find them and where to replace them. He alone is responsible for their safekeeping. The other monks work in the scriptorium and may know the lists of the volumes that the library houses, but a list of titles often tells very little. Only the librarian knows, from the collocation of the volume, from its degree of inaccessibility, what secrets, what truths or falsehoods the volume contains. Only he decides how, when, and whether to give it to the monk who requests it. Sometimes he first consults me, because not all truths are for all ears. Not all falsehoods can be recognized as such by a pious soul. So in the book, as well as in real life, people often get access to information and education only if they are of a certain religion, of a certain nationality, of a certain sex. If that kind of rings a bell, not having access to a library, maybe you're thinking about another very impactful text of the 20th century, Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. There's this very well-known scene in the beginning where she'd like to go to a library as a woman, but she's being stopped. Let me read it to you. But here I was actually at the door which leads into the library itself. I must have opened it, for instantly there issued, like a guardian angel barring the way with a flutter of black gown instead of white wings, a deprecating, silvery, kindly gentleman, who regretted in a low voice, as he waved me back, that ladies are only admitted to the library if accompanied by a fellow of the college or furnished with a letter of introduction. So I think we can all agree that education is no neutral matter. A quote that particularly stuck with me throughout the book was that not all truths are for all ears. I could think about that a lot, right? Is there information that is better kept from people? And most importantly, when does that become an excuse for power and control? A fantastic parallel read that I did was Jason Stanley, How Fascism Works. There are a lot of parallels between what Stanley says and the hierarchies, the controlling of information, and the propaganda in the Abbey that Umberto Eco writes about. So that's what I think makes The Name of the Rose so great. It's like a microcosm of power, right? We can observe and hear what is going on. And if we are smart enough, we see how it's going on all around us as well. Anyways, let me end this point with a short quote from page 200. This place of forbidden knowledge is guarded by many and most cunning devices. Knowledge is used to conceal rather than to enlighten. Moving on to the next point, I wanted to make you aware of the fact that even though this is a story set in a medieval abbey, it is still a very postmodern work of literature. Let me point out some of the signs of postmodernism in this novel. First of all, there are a ton of intertextual references, so references to other works of literature, often in a tongue-in-cheek way. I've already mentioned that the library is based on The Library of Babel by Jorge Luis Borges. There is also a point in the book where they go into the library and they find a text that is written or translated by Umberto of Bologna. So Eco is referencing himself because he was, I think, a professor in Bologna at that time. Of course, the reference to Aristotle's Poetics. William and Atso, their names are actually referring to the characters in The Hounds of the Baskerville. Secondly, the narrative structure of the text is such that we're basically reading a text within a text within a text, right? A text that has been translated, apparently. So at the end of it, us and the narrator, we're not even really sure what we're reading anymore. That is a very postmodern idea. You can also see that throughout the novel there is a constant focus on books, right? So Umberto Eco is kind of going meta, talking about books in his book. He speaks of books speaking of other books and books being made of other books. Again, that intertextuality. Let me read you a quote, page 322. Often books speak of other books. Often a harmless book is like a seed that will blossom into a dangerous book. Or it is the other way around. It is the sweet fruit of a bitter stem. Until then, I had thought each book spoke of the things, human or divine, that lie outside books. Now I realized that not infrequently books speak of books. It is as if they spoke among themselves. In the light of this reflection, the library seemed all the more disturbing to me. It was then the place of a long, centuries-old murmuring, an imperceptible dialogue between one parchment and another, a living thing, a receptacle of powers, not to be ruled by a human mind, a treasure of secrets, emanated by many minds, surviving the death of those who had produced them or had been their conveyors. Another interesting figure in the book and the personification of that question of language is Salvatore, who speaks every language but also none of them. He kind of just puts words one after the other in whatever language I don't know how he makes the decision. It's just, I'll put a quote up. You'll know what I mean. He's like the Tower of Babel personified, like all of the languages somehow live in him, but it's like this Frankenstein monster that just turns out to be really weird. I'll try to read the beginning of the quote. This is one from the German translation though, so I think William Weaver translated it a bit differently, but let's try. Penitentia gite, siehe, Dracoventurus est am fressen animatur, la morts est superno, prego, das Vaterunser komm, a librarnos von Übel de todas la peccata. Hihihi, euch gefällt wohl ist da Necromancia, de Domini Nostri Jesu Christi. Honestly, that's my brain sometimes. Last sign of postmodernism that I want to mention for this video is the title itself, the name of the rose. Many readers, probably all the readers who come to the end of this book will ask themselves, what is the name of the rose? And the title actually intentionally has no meaning. Eco said that he chose this title because a rose has so many meanings that it simultaneously has none. So a rose just had too many meanings throughout human history for it to mean anything. It means so many contradictory things. There's actually a beautiful quote that I'll read to you that illuminates this point a little bit. Page 281. There is a mysterious wisdom by which phenomena among themselves, disparate, can be called by analogous names, just as divine things can be designated by terrestrial terms. And through equivocal symbols, God can be called lion or leopard, and death can be called sword, joy, flame, flame, death, death, abyss, abyss, perdition, perdition, raving, and raving, passion. But if love of the flame and of the abyss are the metaphor for the love of God, can they be the metaphor for love of death and love of sin? Yes, as the lion and the serpent stand both for Christ and the devil. So we're left at the end of this book kind of a little bit like William, having looked for signs and just not being able to put it all together, right? The signs and the symbols and the language, they kind of all escape us. And to me, that is one of the most fascinating discussions of the book, like the limits of logic and rationality and trying to make sense of everything. Here is a quote, a last one for this point, page 296, about the topic of logic. I was upset. I had always believed logic was a universal weapon, and now I realized how its validity depended on the way it was employed. Further, since I had been with my master, I had become aware, and was to become even more aware in the days that followed, that logic could be especially useful when you entered it, but then left it. And for point number 5, I've just put together some practical advice for going through this book. So one of the most important things is for you to get a translation of all the Latin bits. There's a lot of Latin throughout this novel. And in my edition, again, the Everyman's Library, there are no translations of that Latin. There's no footnote, no endnote, no nothing. So that's annoying. But I found a really good blog of someone who translated all the Latin, and I would highly recommend you just print that out or have that handy when you go through it, because it's kind of annoying if you don't understand sentences that seem important. I sometimes wonder whether Eco did that on purpose to make us feel what it's like to not understand something, right? I mean, Latin was the language of the church. I mean, still is, but you had to speak Latin in order to even be in those circles. So maybe he's giving us a little bit of the same effect or something. Or maybe he wants us to learn Latin. I mean, he mentioned several times in the novel that the first duty of a scholar is to learn languages. I love that. Next, practical advice is to keep track of the characters' names. What's tricky about this book and the characters is that they're all monks. The main characters are all monks. They're all men. They're all, I don't know, most of them are kind of old. So it's really handy if you just like take a pencil and write in the front of the book whenever a new character comes up, just write down their name and a few lines of what they're about. Usually the narrator says, oh, this is so-and-so. He's an herbalist. He's been at the abbey for so-and-so many years. Just jot that down in some notes, because you will lose track of all the characters. At least I did. If you feel like it, look up their names. A lot of them have speaking names. Jorge of Burgos is, of course, a reference to Jorge Luis Borges, whose short story The Library of Babel influenced Eco, as I already mentioned. It was so funny when Umberto Eco was asked why he called that character Jorge of Burgos. And Eco said that, well, he realized at some point that he accidentally created a blind librarian and he couldn't not honor his friend. I think they really admired each other and he had to call him Jorge of Burgos. And then people asked him, but why is he so evil? And he said that he didn't know in the beginning that he would turn out to be such an evil character. Further practical advice, understanding the structure. So in the beginning, our narrator explains that the novel will be divided in 7 days and each day into 8 sections, which correspond to the times of prayer for the monks in the abbey. So monks prayed 8 times a day: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nones, vespers, and compline. And the chapters correspond to the order of prayer in the abbey. That doesn't have to further concern or confuse you. When the monks were not in prayer, they copied and illuminated books or religious scriptures. There were always monks who were herbalists, healers, gardeners, or that grew food for the monastery. So, yeah, that's that structure. Of course, the 7 days also have a sacred meaning. And what I really like is that actually in the beginning of each chapter there's like a short summary of what's about to happen. Makes it really easy to find your way back. Lastly, on the number 7, there's also a lot of talk about the 7 trumpets of the apocalypse, referring to the book of Revelation. Those trumpets were basically a series of symbolic warnings that God's final judgment day is near. You might want to know about that now that I'm thinking about it. Last thing I'll say about the book, there is a movie. I didn't like the movie. I think it focuses way too much on the love story and it leaves out a lot of what I think are the greatest conversation in the book. So, watch it if you want, but I think it really shifts the priorities around in a way I didn't like. Don't get me wrong, the love scene is important and it is described in the book, but it's just so much more beautiful in the book. I want to read you this last quote, page 313 and 314. My intellect knew her as an occasion of sin. My sensitive appetite perceived her as the vessel of every grace. It was as if all creation spoke to me of her. It was, now I'm trying to understand, as if, just as the whole universe is surely like a book written by the finger of God, in which everything speaks to us of the immense goodness of its creator, in which every creature is description and mirror of life and death, in which the humblest rose becomes a gloss of our terrestrial progress. Everything, in other words, spoke to me only of the face I had hardly glimpsed in the aromatic shadows of the kitchen. Oh my gosh, so beautiful. You know what? I think this might be my favorite book. I'm calling it. It's way up there with Proust for me. You know, I love Marcel Proust, famously my favorite book, because it really speaks to that intuitive feeling side of me. But I also have a real intellectual thirst. I love it when a book challenges me, when it speaks of language and symbols, and I kind of, I don't know, have to work at it in that way. Yeah, man, it's a really good book. I hope you give it a try. And don't worry about catching everything. You're not gonna catch everything the first read. I didn't. Just keep reading. Let me know how it goes. And let's hope that truth, like God, is its own propagator. I love you all so much. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you again the next time. Bye-bye.